Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University and Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, find other episodes, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is September 19th, 2011, and my guest is Alex Rosenberg, the R. Taylor Cole Professor of Philosophy at Duke University. Alex, welcome to EconTalk.
Thanks. It's great to be with you, Russ.
In 1994, in an essay titled, "If Economics Isn't a Science, What Is It?" you wrote a very interesting essay. I want to read a couple of quotes from it as our jumping off point. Here's the first one. Quote, "The ability to predict and control may be neither necessary nor sufficient criteria for cognitively respectable scientific theories. But the fact is that microeconomic theory has made no advances in the management of economic processes since its current formalism was first elaborated in the 19th century." You also wrote, that's on the end of the quote, you also wrote, quote, "Euclidean geometry was once styled the science of space, but calling it a science did not make it one. We have come to view advances in the axiomatization and extension of geometry as events not in science, but in mathematics. Economics is often defined as the science of the distribution of scarce resources, but calling it a science does not make it one. For much of their history, since 1800, advances in both these disciplines have consisted in improvements of deductive rigor, economy, and elegance of expression, in better axiomatizations, and in the proofs of more and more general results, without much concern as to the usefulness of these results." Very dramatic statements, and I'm curious if you still feel that way. If you do, please elaborate on those ideas, and if you don't, why don't you?
Well, that's very interesting. I have to go back and say, first thing is that I said those two things not in 1994, but in 1984.
Oh, thank you.
And by 1994, I might already have been prepared somewhat to qualify them. I think that they were very accurate as claims about economics in the 70s and by the mid-80s. I think, of course, there were exceptions, and I think these exceptions have, in the last 20 years, drawn more and more attention and had a greater and greater impact on the nature of economics as a discipline. And I think I'd have to say, on the one hand, that with qualifications, I'm still sympathetic to the view about standards for science and scientific progress that stood at the background of those 2 points. And on the other hand, I have recognized changes in economic science since that time that make it at least somewhat less susceptible of that kind of analysis, not to say critique. I would be more specific and point to the increased thought about the nature of choice under uncertainty and asymmetries of information, characterized by the work, for example, of Akerlof most famously. The interest in experimental economics that secured for Vernon Smith a Nobel Prize. And most of all, the impact of Kahneman and Tversky and cognitive social psychology on the way in which economists think about microeconomic processes, of which perhaps the most widely known example is the Vishny and Schleifer paper on the limits to arbitrage. All of these suggest that, to varying degrees, economics as a discipline has been increasingly sensitive to the kind of charges, not as I laid them, because I think that economists have generally been indifferent to what philosophers have said about the subject, but much more sensitive to these kinds of charges over the last 20 years, and much more responsive to developments in other parts of social science that have made economics less, how shall I say, guilty of the kind of hermetic insulation from the demands of application that quote, both of those quotes that you started with, articulate.
That may be, but it is still true, I think, that formal economic theory is still subject to the critique that you made there. It's true that economics as, quote, practiced by economists has gotten a little less axiomatic, you might say, and I think the behavioral economics literature is an example of that. But I guess my question would be that behavioral literature, I don't see how it's made economics any more scientific in its ability to predict and measure. Or am I missing your point?
It's clear that the discipline of economics is only now taking on and trying to figure out how to reshape its theory to take account of the factors that behavioral economics, evolutionary economics, and experimental economics have introduced, and that at least in areas like financial economics, the traditional Walrasian, post-Walrasian, neoclassical paradigm continues to be the dominant force. If you look at the kind of intellectual cachet that people like Eugene Fama have, or that other Chicago freshwater school economists have in, say, business schools and in the theory of finance, financial economics, that there the paradigm still seems to be of the Walrasian sort that I was criticizing in those quotes. The role of equilibrium thinking continues to be the same as it was back then. And although the word Austrian no longer has the kind of demonic possession is a nice next word, but I didn't mean possession. The demonic halo that it used to have when economists would talk about people like von Mises and Schumpeter and even Hayek. Still, the standard neoclassical approach does seem to me to, although it still holds the field, but it's at any rate much more defensive than it was when I wrote those things about it in the 80s. And of course, I did hold and develop much the same view in a book I published in the early 90s called Economics, Mathematical Politics, or Science of Diminishing Returns, which in its title, of course, reflects the very theses that you quoted from the 1984 paper.
Explain for the non-specialist what you mean by Walrasian, pre-Walrasian, post-Walrasian equilibrium approach.
Well,
what's the essence of the economist view there?
If we go back to Adam Smith, in the economics which owes its existence and its intellectual pedigree to the wealth of nations, starts with the hidden hand or the invisible hand, according to which we do not owe our well-being to the benevolence of the butcher and the baker, but to his self-interest. And the idea that each individual pursuing their own narrow self-interest produces an outcome that is of benefit to the entire society, the market price system, and its allocative efficiency is an idea which, though Smith originated it, economists set about trying to prove thereafter formally, and it was only Walras who thought that he had finally proved it by arguing that in an economy in which supply and demand in each market could be equilibrated, such that there were the same number of equations of equilibrium as there were numbers of goods to be supplied and demanded, that under such circumstances there would be a unique market clearing, allocatively efficient price. And the proof that Walras thought he had produced, of course, was not entirely adequate, and it took another 70 years or so before Abraham Wald, in the late 30s, produced another version of this proof, and still that was not entirely accepted in the profession, and nothing until the late 50s, until Debreu and Arrow produced a formal proof of the Pareto optimality of the unique and stable equilibrium in all prices that characterized a perfectly free market economy. And that unique stable equilibrium continues to be a kind of a combination litmus test and touchstone of economic theorizing. The mathematical economics continues to be pursued on the understanding that the objective is to establish always the partial or the general equilibrium outcome of a economic process, so that the way in which we understand the dynamic, continually changing economy is as a series of price and quantity vectors that, if only exogenous forces could be held at bay, would come to an equilibrium and are constantly adjusting themselves back in the direction of an equilibrium from the interference or the existence of these exogenous forces. So that economics, mainstream neoclassical economics, continues to be invested in the intellectual importance, the explanatory role of general equilibrium, even though it recognizes that equilibrium never actually obtains.
Kind of awkward, isn't it? It's a certain requires a certain intellectual schizophrenia, which I want to try
but they would respond. What they would respond, and here I speak in defense of mainstream theorists, that if you look at markets, the one thing you notice is that almost never will a change in one price result in a catastrophic explosion of all prices so as to produce chaos. The only time that we know of that this happens is in the hyperinflations of Weimar Germany or maybe Zimbabwe under Mugabe. And they will argue, therefore, that the assumption of stability is one that's so well established that no theory can be taken seriously unless it has stability as one of its implications, and that at least the market clearing uniquely stable equilibrium has therefore a great deal to recommend it.
Well, there's a lot of stability in the real world. There's no doubt about that, and I guess the question is, how much does economics explain of that? I have a different perspective, I guess. I don't understand. I'm going to put you in the awkward position now of continuing to defend the neoclassical approach. Ironic, given that I'm a Chicago PhD who was trained in that tradition. But I think my challenge is to that claim, the way you phrased it, is the following. Adam Smith said that good things happen despite the fact that some people don't have the best of motives, or motives the purest of motives. They're self-interested. And I think that's a very deep insight. He wasn't the first person to have that insight. It's a version of it's in
Mandeville and others.
Right. But he said it in a way that resonated and stuck, and he wrote well, and he understood it perhaps in ways that I think he definitely understood it in ways that they did not. So we have this insight that good things happen sometimes despite the fact that people don't have the best motives. The fundamental question I have is, what have we gained through the sequence of Walras? I'd put Samuelson in there in 1948 with the foundations of economic analysis, Arrow and Debreu, who took that to a much more theoretical level, and I was going to say higher, I'm not sure what the right adjective is, but to a different level, solve some of the problems as you mentioned. We now have shown in some formal theoretical sense that, yes, there is a set of prices such that under certain circumstances, which never hold in the real world, the letting people buy and sell freely ends up with a result that has some attractive characteristics. That's how I would describe what gets called Pareto optimality or the various theorems of welfare economics.
No, I think all that's fair. And you want me to defend that?
Well, you could try. I think or you could pile on. But my point is that, and this is where I want to get more into the philosophy of science. What have we gained? What are the dimensions of what we might have gained? In other words, I don't see anything that's more predictable about the world, confirmable, measurable, testable about the world from those theories relative to what we had before.
Right. Let me give you what I think of as the best defense I can. And I have to say, frankly, I've been searching for a defense for this character of the theory for a very long time, because I'd rather find a good explanation for the tremendous admiration that so many very smart people have had for economics over the last 200 years, and particularly given its imperialism, its methodological and substantive theoretical imperialism in the social sciences. I'm not impressed by the fact that there's a Nobel Prize for it. I know exactly why the Nobel Prize for it was created.
It is in economic sciences.
Pardon me?
It is a prize.
Yes, for economic sciences, exactly. There's a purely rhetorical role that it plays. But economics is a discipline in which a great deal of genius has been labored, and it's the default position has to be that it's an important arena of intellectual achievement. So let me see if I can at least give you part of an answer, or as close as I can come to a satisfactory answer, an answer that's satisfactory to the economists to your question. First of all, if we think about mainstream economics, neoclassical economics, the economics that comes from Smith through Valra, Wald, Samuelson, DeBrew, Scarf, Hurwitz, Arrow, all of these great figures. If we think about it as institution design, in the way that Jim Buchanan and Gordon Tullock coined that term, then it has a really important role because the proof of the allocative efficiency of the perfectly competitive market, which that equilibrium approach eventuates in, is a blueprint for organizing complex human societies in such a way as to produce the largest quantity of what people really want. And we have, of course, in the history of the 20th century, the short 20th century, we have a great deal of very positive empirical evidence for the claim that no other alternative way of producing and distributing goods and services comes anywhere close to the free market and in its allocative efficiency, and some of them are catastrophically bad at it.
True.
And to the extent that the proof of the existence, stability, and uniqueness of a general equilibrium is an important part of the argument for a certain set of institutions, economic institutions, then it is a powerful achievement. And when you add in that the proof and the assumptions of the proof, perfect divisibility, no asymmetries of information, avoidance of externalities, constant returns to scale, when you add in the fact that these assumptions in effect provide guidelines for government intervention in order to secure greater approximation to allocative efficiency, either by breaking up monopolies or prohibiting insider trading or forcing polluters to internalize their externalities, when you think about the way in which this proof provides guidelines to government intervention in order to secure allocative efficiency, you have still another powerful argument for the applicability of this intellectual achievement. But it's a very limited argument because, as I said, it's an argument that underwrites a certain set of institutional designs. And we want out of science something more than mere institutional design. We want actual prediction of events that we would like to control and to at least, if not control, insulate or protect ourselves from. And there, of course, is where this version of economics has not done as well as it needs to do in order to attain the standards that that the natural sciences and that biology have attained. Now, people are often likely to deny that, say, a science like biology has great predictive power, and that therefore economics, which certainly has less predictive power than biology, nevertheless has a right to its place among the sciences. But I think, in fact, that if you spend as much time thinking about biology as I have, you'll see that there are a lot of reasons why it should be predictively considerably more powerful than, say, economics. And you might also find a basis for concluding that economics can't, as a matter of fact, attain to a very high level of predictive accuracy, that there are limits to our very ability to frame a scientific theory of economic behavior.
Yeah, well, I want to come back to biology in a minute, and I want to try to lead us there with a couple of questions about predictability. Before we do that, I want to mention register disagreement with your argument, which I think it's an interesting argument. I think it's commonly held by most economists. So, to be fair to you, I don't know how much you accept it as relative to how much you were standing in for the economist's viewpoint, which is that the framework, through its assumptions of competitiveness, symmetric information, no information asymmetries, no externalities, etc., homogeneous goods, that this opens up the toolkit for government intervention in a way to lead us toward allocative efficiency. And given that you invoked Buchanan and Tullock in talking about institutional design, of course, they were very important figures in pointing out, seminal figures in pointing out that what government does versus what economists think it should do are not the same thing. And I think in many ways, economics, through its focus on efficiency and inefficiency, that is, through the focus on how well the price system works, but it requires this assumption, and if this assumption doesn't hold, therefore this intervention is justified. I think that's given government a frequently useful rationalization for intervention that doesn't move us toward efficiency, but rather serves the politically powerful, what's called public choice.
Yeah, so that's the great insight of the wildly misnamed public choice theory.
It's a bad,
I mean, the theory of public choice is the theory of how private choices deflect public choices or public decisions. But and of course, we understand all too well why governments fail often to act in the interests of the governed, owing to considerations that Tullock and Buchanan and other, Jeff Brennan and other important public choice theorists have themselves identified.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to this question of predictability, which I think is a subtle and difficult question. I struggle with it myself. I'm going to start with micro. We'll move on to macro, I hope, at the end, which I think is even I actually think is easier to think about. But let's talk about micro. One of the standard predictions, and I'll put that word in quotes, one of the standard predictions of microeconomic theory is that a binding price control produces a binding price ceiling produces a shortage. Mm-hmm. And I taught at Stanford in the mid '80s, and I had a teaching assistant who I found was telling my students very different things in his office hours than I was telling my students, which was fascinating, and asked him why he would do that. I was teaching that when price was below the market clearing price, that would result in a shortage, and that in turn would usually, depends on the institutional rules, but would often result in lines, in queues, in waiting, and that time would allocate the good along with money, and that the full price would actually be higher if you included the money price and the time price, et cetera, et cetera. Certain standard results of microeconomics. His reaction was he had been told differently in his micro class. He was being taught by a game theorist, and he told me with great assurance that he had learned that anything could happen. And I thought, well, I suppose that's true. But if we put a price control, because for many reasons, of course, anything could happen. Intervening events, changes in all kinds of things. But he was being taught what you might call a non-equilibrium theory of economics. And I said, well, let's make a bet. Let's suppose if the government were to put on, at that time, let's say the price of bread was $2, say $1 a loaf. If the government tomorrow announced that bread would be 10 cents, that no one could charge more than 10 cents a loaf or 50 cents a loaf, something well below the current price, do you think a line would form, and how long would it take? Or do you think you wouldn't be sure anything could happen? Maybe there'd be no line and everything would be the same as it was before. And he of course, being a student and being told by someone smarter than I was that anything could happen, he said, well, yeah, anything could happen. I wouldn't want to bet for sure what would happen. And now when I said I'm confident, my confidence was partly based on the pictures that I drew for my students of supply and demand and some kind of equilibrium. And when pressed today, I tell my students this is a useful fiction. There's not one price of bread. There's many different kinds of bread. Even for a particular kind, there's price variation for many reasons we could talk about. But I'm still pretty confident that this framework of thinking about competition, even though there aren't an infinite number of goods, even though even though all quality isn't the same, even though not all consumers and sellers.
Well, let me cut you short. I agree with you. Now, here's the connection to prediction. Once we have established, say, the generic prediction, as I called it in a paper that I wrote right around the time I wrote that 84 paper you started with, if we start with a generic prediction that price controls produce queues and shortages, the next natural step in the process of science is to quantify the prediction.
Exactly.
How much
that was my next question. Yeah.
Pardon me?
That was my next question. Yeah.
How much of a shortage and when will the shortage obtain and how long will it take for the shortage to be remediated, and will the result eventually be a surplus? And if so, exactly how much and how long will it take for that surplus to occur? And will the result of that surplus be a subsequent another shortage? And how much will that of a shortage will that be, and when will it occur? The process whereby we move from generic to specific predictions, something that is characteristic, for example, of meteorology in our own time, and of agronomy, agriculture, and of a variety of different biological phenomena. So that process is one that we have never seen in economics. And if we get a lot more specific and say, given the law of supply and demand and the shape of demand curves, there are elasticities and cross-elasticities and income and elasticity effects of the sort you might find in what used to be called the Slutsky equation. There's a natural research program that suggests itself of attempting to establish the values of those parameters and variables and to actually determine the shape of that curve. And you and I both know, as economists and students of economics, two things. First, that no economist has ever successfully established the values of those variables for a reasonable range of commodities over a reasonable time period, and that we now know, indeed we could have known back in the 40s when these kinds of projects may have suggested themselves, why they cannot be accomplished.
Well, there was a large research program, of course, that tried to estimate elasticities,
sure.
And by that, for the non-economists out there, it's basically a that's one particular way of measuring how responsive people's purchasing demands are to changes in price. So,
yeah, it's like actually determining the exact shape of the downward sloping demand curve. Exactly how quickly does it slope downward? What is its slope at each point? And how does that slope change over time?
So thousands of hours,
and price.
Thousands of hours, maybe tens or thousands, hundreds of thousands were spent on that enterprise. And I think what we learned, one of the things we learned from that, perhaps, I'm going to give it the benefit of the doubt, is that some goods are more responsive than others, to which many people would reply, yeah, so what? But I'm curious why you think that project was a failure. Certainly they could have said in defense of it, well, it's approximate, it's close, it's in the ballpark. Why do you think it was a failure, and why do you think we should have known that in advance?
I think that the reason it was a failure was that the demand curves are intertemporally unstable to the degree that once you establish one with elasticities at a given time for a given commodity, its usefulness in predicting consumer behavior in the next period is relatively weak and gets weaker as subsequent periods occur. I think that the technology for establishing these values, the difficulty, the cost, combined with the limited usefulness of them, literally useful maybe from a week to a week or something like that, made it a mug's game to actually do this work. And what's worse, of course, the intervention of new products, new tastes,
sure.
And various kinds of complementaries and substitutivities among consumer durables. Anybody who understood that deeply enough understood how pointless it was to try to calculate elasticities, because even if you got them right, it was for a particular commodity at a particular time in a particular market, and nothing of much interest followed, certainly nothing precise enough to enable you to make a dollar followed about the market demand and supply of even a closely similar commodity in the next week. Even if it was gasoline prices or or bags of wheat, it turned out that this entire enterprise was always overtaken by events at such a rate that it was never worthwhile doing the empirical work necessary. Now, what does that suggest? Does that suggest that
we just need better techniques?
Does it suggest better? Look, it could suggest better techniques. It could suggest that your theory, you got the wrong theory altogether. We don't need this theory. This is not the way in which to produce a predictively powerful science of human economic behavior. Or it might be the even more radical conclusion that there is no such theory within reach of human beings. That's, of course, the Austrian.
Yeah, that would be the critique of Hayek in 1945, The Use of Knowledge in Society, a paper I reference here about every 7 shows. But
that's funny because I think about it almost every other day.
Yeah, Vernon Smith,
that's probably the single most important paper in the Austrian tradition in economics.
No doubt. And Vernon Smith confessed to having read it numerous times when I interviewed him about it. And I've written...
It's much more important than the road to serfdom.
I agree.
It's the reason that Hayek should be celebrated as a great economist and not the silly claims made on his behalf by conservatives and Republicans to try to sandbag economic responses to our current economic downturn.
Well, I agree with the first part of that.
I know you do.
I'm not quite sure about the second.
Provocative.
Well, I want to come. Maybe we'll come back to that because I'm not. I'd like to hear some of those specifics. It's certainly true that Hayek and all great thinkers are used for political purposes, sometimes in ways that are not fair to their origin. But let's go to biology.
Sure.
Because and I know you've spent a lot of time thinking about biology, and I've spent a little time, which, as Pope said, a little learning is a dangerous thing. I want to make a claim, and I want to get your reaction to it. My claim is that the essence, the value of economics, I don't know whether it's a science or not, To the extent it is a science, it is like the science of biology, and I will leave for you to talk about the science-ness of biology, but by that I mean that economics is a very powerful way of helping us think about complex systems where things are interconnected. And I've written, and been maligned occasionally by bloggers, I have written that just as we would never ask a biologist to predict how many beavers would be alive in an ecosystem if we chop down 20% of the trees in this region, because that's something that biology isn't good at predicting. Similarly, we should not ask economics to do something it's incapable of doing, which is if the government spends an extra $820 billion, it'll create 1.7 million jobs or 1.74 million jobs. And I say that because, one, I'm not sure of the value of the underlying theory that leads to that prediction. And since I can't confirm it through observation and empirical tests, that is, 5 or 10 years from now, when I go to check the beaver population, so many things have changed in the meanwhile that I don't have data on. I can't confirm if my original theory was correct. I have that same problem with macroeconomics, and therefore I'm left with the real reality. The economics is not good for many of the questions that people demand it to answer, but that does not mean economics is useless, just like biology is not useless. What's your reaction to that?
I think my reaction is that you underplay the predictive powers of economic theory, biological theory, excuse me.
Phew.
And that the reasons why some biological processes are predictively recalcitrant are on a continuum with reasons why many economic predictions are likely to be overtaken by events and to prove either useless or falsified. And there are some further variables that complicate economics' recalcitrance to predictive improvement. So let me walk through that. First of all, it's certainly the case that biological processes have a kind of instability that is also to be found in economics, and we understand that instability very well. It's basically the arms race instability of strategic interaction. It happens that in the biological realm, the realm controlled by natural selection, that adaptations inevitably become part of the environment, which filter for new adaptations. The random variation that produces traits that then get filtered by the environment is the process whereby biological phenomena increase their adaptation, increase their fitness up to, say, levels close to perfection in a very stable environment. Give a biological system long enough in a stable enough environment, and there will, by natural selection alone, be a very strong drive of the traits of the biological system to optimality. The trouble is that the environments are not universally stable.
Just like economics, yeah.
Well, over geological time, there's a huge amount of stability. But once organic phenomena, once biological phenomena begin to be parts of the environments of one another, then each organism's trait becomes part of the environment of the other organisms that it's competing with, and the result is that it incites variation, or at least selection, among the random variants in the other organisms for ways of taking advantage of itself. And this is, of course, what produces the arms race. Arms races don't get really serious, that is to say, they don't become fast enough that we need to worry about them in understanding biological processes, probably until you get to the interaction of different species with one another, predator and prey interaction, for example. But even in the case of predators and prey, predictions are still possible, and that's why ecology is increasingly powerful as science, and we can make some reliable predictions about population densities over seasons. I think you gave the example of beavers in ecology, and it's just for the same reason that we've been able to reliably predict the weather over the last couple of years because of the combination of increased data points and cheaper supercomputers. Similarly, we can do this increasingly in biology. We can even predict, in some cases, what the likely DNA sequence that's going to be selected for by way of a mutant bacterium by a new pharmacology. So at the level of microbiology, we might say, like microeconomics, there's some significant improvement in predictive power, and even at the level of macrobiology, in ecology, there are at least the prospects of similar improvements because our own calculating devices are improving faster than the arms race environmental changes. And none of that is true in economics.
Well, I don't know. It's reminds me of our earlier discussion. So let me challenge your conclusion and see what I'm missing. With a small enough ecosystem and enough knowledge of the participants in the biological case, you're saying we could make some predictions about whether the population would grow or shrink in response to those exogenous changes like chopping down trees.
We might even be able to make predictions about the likely emergence of novel traits.
Yeah, okay, so that's cool. But you think you're going to get anything close to and that I would argue is not too dissimilar from saying if you put on a price ceiling, you get a shortage. You challenged that conclusion by saying, yeah, but how much of a shortage, how long would it take?
Exactly.
Do you think we have made enough progress in, say, and I'm going to pick a big enough ecosystem because I don't want to talk about the microeconomics of my class. I want to talk about the market for gasoline. And then I want to go micro, then macro. And similarly for biology, I want to go lab, ecosystem, and then interacting ecosystems. Do you think for an ecosystem such as, say, Yellowstone Park, that we would have decent predictions about, say, the reintroduction of wolves, which was done in the last decade or so, and the impact on the elk population? Yes, we can make some vague, general, qualitative predictions about the elk population. Can we make some quantitative ones?
I don't know at this point whether wildlife ecologists actually are making quantitative predictions and seeing them borne out, but I can certainly anticipate that they will be able to in the foreseeable future.
That's what people say about economics, too, by the way. So
really?
Yeah, no, they do. They say, in fact, Ricardo Reich, guest on this program, a neo-Keynesian at Columbia, a first-rate scholar, said, we've mastered monetary theory, but we need more time for fiscal theory, and we'll get there eventually. I disagree. I don't think we'll get there. When I joked about being criticized in the blogosphere, when I made that I blogged on this point about beavers, somebody mocked me and said, oh, biologists do that all the time. They predict how many beavers are going to be in 10 years. We're required by government law often to make predictions about what's going to happen. And I'm thinking, yeah. And I wrote the guy back. I said, and what's the verifiability of that prediction? Very low. Very, very difficult 10 years now. And certainly you wouldn't get the answer right, even if you could verify it.
And 10 years is probably too long.
Too long.
And my own view about economics is that at least in the case of macroeconomics, the impediments, the obstacles to a similar improvement in predictive power are merely ones of degree, not ones of kind.
Meaning?
Meaning that since I'm committed to the claim that biology either already does or will soon be in a position to make quantitative predictions about, say, predator-prey relations, similarly, there is in principle, no philosophical, no logical, no causal obstacle to predictions of the same kind among macroeconomists.
Which would be, for example, what would be an analogy there?
Money supply and interest rate, short-term Phillips curve,
money supply and inflation.
Well, yeah. money supply and interest rate, and money supply and inflation, inflation and employment. I can well imagine that insofar as these macro relationships are symptomatic of traits of adapted institutions which are competing with one another, and that might be in some relatively short-term local equilibrium over a long enough time for economists to be able to calculate that those kinds of predictions are, at least in principle, possible. So, I used to believe that it was impossible to move economics from generic to specific predictions. I'm now inclined to think it's just extremely difficult.
Yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting question. I think the Great Moderation, so-called Great Moderation, this period of relative economic calm between 1982 and 2008. At the time, that encouraged a lot of people to believe that we had made fundamental progress in our ability to measure and steer the macroeconomy.
Correct. That's absolutely true.
Now, John Taylor, who's an important part of that argument and who's been a guest on this program a number of times, would argue that the reason that we can't do that anymore is because we failed to learn the lessons of that time. But many others would argue that it was a game we could not really play, that we only
and
thought we were
my
playing.
analysis is that it was a period of local equilibrium between competing economic forces, which eventually broke down in an arms race. And it was the breakdown. The breakdown is the subprime mortgage denouement of 2008, and that is the result of the technological computational powers of traders exploiting the heuristics of non-financial economic agents looking for relatively safe places to put their investments, reaching a point where the non-rational heuristic economic agents realized that they had to start using the same tools as the people who were exploiting them.
Yeah, I look at it differently, but I don't want to go into that now, other than to point out that I think government policy that made it harder for people to bear their losses and keep their gains, particularly bear their losses, removed the natural forces that would have made those analytical tools that were dangerous less so. I
agree with that, absolutely.
Vernon Smith really is the right person here, and he's not won the day, but I think he's won my day, obviously, because
I think you and I both have the same analysis of what happened.
It fits my bias, so I have to be careful. But the idea that people make mistakes all the time. They get overly excited. They're prone to exuberance. But markets have a natural way of punishing that when people get out of hand, and we've made it harder for markets to do that.
And I see it as arms race, and arms races always end in some kind of a reestablished equilibrium.
Let's close with a different topic. You're a philosopher of science. You're interested in the philosophy of science. Most economists pay no attention, and I assume most scientists pay no attention to these kind of discussions.
Absolutely. Most economists don't, but many scientists do.
But the most famous work in the philosophy of science would be Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolution, at least in modern times.
No, I can't agree with that. Thomas Kuhn's book is, of course, an extremely important work in the history of science, and it is one that has been used as a stick with which to beat off the attack on non-scientific disciplines with, but I would hardly characterize it as the most important. I would accept it as the most influential.
That's what I think.
Book in this area.
I thought maybe I should have said most famous, most well known. Mm-hmm. My crude estimate of science's response to that is negative, right? Most scientists don't find it persuasive. Is that true?
Most scientists do not find Kuhn's analysis of the nature of
scientific progress persuasive.
I think that's correct. They certainly do not find the extreme version, the extreme interpretation of his view, which is common in the humanities and in some areas of interpretive social science, as plausible. However, Kuhn himself rejected that interpretation and was appalled throughout the last 20 years of his life at the way in which his views had come to be interpreted.
Interesting. But my general question is, not that it's decisive or perhaps even important, but I'm just intrigued by the fact that philosophers study science and scientists, and they're not studying ants, they're studying human beings. Right. And the human beings they're studying don't always pay much attention to it. What's your reaction to that?
Well, there's a famous quote of that great philosopher of science who didn't think he was one, Richard Feynman, who once said that philosophy of physics is to physicists as ornithology is to birds. And that was his way of writing off the discipline of the philosophy of science. It was a wag, and I wish I was he, who said, well, yeah. In fact, physicists know about as much about the philosophy of physics as birds know about ornithology.
Yeah, that's a good comeback.
And it is a good comeback. and I have to say that it's not the function of the philosophy of science to tell physicists what to do. It's not even the function of philosophy of science to tell chemists or even biologists what to do. But there are problems in these disciplines, and biology is probably the best example, that are conceptual and that have attracted the interests of philosophers and in which philosophers have made considerable contributions. And that's one reason why the biologists are inclined to listen to us, or at least to talk with us. And if you know much about the history of physics in the last 100 years, especially Einstein and quantum mechanics, you know about the influence of minds like Leibniz's and Bishop Berkeley's, their influence on the understanding of space and time, and you know about the difficulties involved in the interpretation, in making intelligible quantum mechanics. For the physicists to say, shut up and do the calculations at the back of the chapter, that's all you need, is probably safe and effective as a discipline.
Good career advice. It's good career advice for a graduate student.
And this, of course, is what the point that Kuhn made about normal science and the discipline it imposes. But science eventually and always finds itself faced with anomalies, and when it begins to treat those anomalies as central, and this is Kuhn talking, the philosopher has a role to play. Now, ask yourself whether economics as a discipline, rolling on from Smith through Walras to Samuelson and De Brue and Ullman and Scarf and Arrow, has yet to accept or recognize that there is an anomaly. I suggest that there are some economists, of whom Paul Krugman is probably the best example, who are pounding their hands on the table and insisting there's a big, bad bug in our discipline, and we've got to figure out what to do with it. And insofar as Kuhn provided us with an account of how normal science develops into a revolutionary period, he may help us understand that this is one in economics. Now, are the economists going to solve their problems by paying attention to the philosophers? Well, it may concentrate their minds the way the gallows it was said by Dr. Johnson to concentrate. the mind wonderfully, but the solution isn't going to be found in the philosophy of science, and we don't purport to provide it. That's not our function, and that wouldn't even count as good philosophy of science. Should economists pay attention to the philosophy of science? A bit, but not a lot. The solution to their problems is not going to be found in our discipline. But that they have a problem, and what the broad outlines of that problem and what blind alleys down which they shouldn't proceed in seeking solutions to that problem are, that's probably things that we can help on. Probably not me, because I don't do much of this anymore, but I think if you think about the work of, say, Dan Hausman, or an economist like Kevin Hoover, or any number of others, we're likely to say things that may jog the complacency of the discipline.
My guest today has been Alex Rosenberg. Alex, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for giving me this chance to think about some of these questions again and think on my feet about them, because they are very difficult questions to which the answers probably require a great deal more reflection than one can really devote to them in an exchange like this.
Hear, hear. This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.